Detroit News. While many of you might know, that was officially announced last month, but he's been serving in that role for quite some time. He is primarily responsible for supervising local news and business coverage, and he was most recently the News's local editor. He has held a number of editing roles overseeing coverage of the city of Detroit, Southeast Michigan, and breaking news since 2009. He joined the News initially in 2004 as a copy editing intern. He had earlier worked as a reporting intern at the newspaper in the summer of 2002 while he was attending Michigan State University, go Green. And he is a graduate of MSU and a former editor of the State News. So with that, welcome to Kevin Hardy. Thanks so much for being here today, Kevin. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Sure thing. So to go ahead and get started, I think it would be helpful for you to just explain your role as managing editor of the Detroit News and kind of level set for everybody what exactly that means and your responsibilities at the News.
Yeah, so the managing editor is essentially in charge of news coverage. I'm the person that directs basically from how we cover Michigan to how we cover the country to how we cover Metro Detroit, from both news, business, sports, features, everything except our editorial department. I have no overlap with Nolan's group, Nolan Finley. But outside of that, the news directive falls under my purview. We kind of have a separation of church and state when it comes to our editorial board, even though my name does appear above it as far as the masthead. Everything that we do is independent from the editorial operation of their opinion section. So I'm solely focused on making sure that we have fair, unbiased, neutral news. The opinions are yours, not ours, in our coverage. We're trying to be fair. We're trying to get the most complete version of the truth that's possible. And I once met Bob Woodward from the Washington Post, and a journalist's goal is to get the most attainable version of the truth. I really feel like that's our responsibilities here at the News, is trying to make sure that we're getting all sides, all opinions, and trying to show balance in our coverage. And so that's my chief responsibility, is making sure that, hey, we're getting you guys the information that you expect from us, that we're breaking information that is important and relevant to your lives, and making sure that we do it in a manner that is both transparent and fair.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. As you have assumed this role as managing editor, and I know we've talked that you've been kind of serving in that role for a while, although, obviously it was just more recently officially announced. But as you look, obviously the news industry has changed pretty significantly in recent history,
Yeah.
and certainly definitely in most recent history amid the pandemic. But as you look toward the future for the Detroit News, what is your vision at large? I mean, what, in terms of your position, are you looking to bring to the Detroit News in terms of your place in the region, the country, and what is your long-term vision for the News in your role?
So what's interesting about my history here is I was afforded a seat at the table very early in my career, which I think for this organization, when you look at like a legacy paper, that's pretty rare. Usually you have to, have put in 20, 30 years before you get that seat. This newspaper, when I first came on board, was already ready for change. In fact, I'd gone through a couple old papers. This was published during my first year at the paper, which we were building a new printing facility and looking to the future as far as our print operation. And the publisher called, kind of an informal press conference to announce the new presses. And he asked for questions, and I raised my hand and I said, do you really think that the printing press is the most viable operation for us in the future? Because at this point it was being touted as being full color. We were going to be able to distribute more zones. And I was already concerned that the internet was taking over. All the way back in 2003, 2004. And when given the opportunity, I left the print side in 2006 and went to our digital operation, which at that time really felt like the B team. And a lot of people were like, why are you going to the web? And I said, the web's the future. And so I spent a lot of time adapting kind of our print principles in our digital environment and then growing the digital environment. In 2012, I was part of a task force that kind of revolutionized our newsroom. We looked at kind of reinventing what journalism was going to be like going forward. We created a breaking news desk because ultimately my goal was to get information to people the fastest. And I was not worried about the red tape and the bureaucracy that had existed in the newsroom for more than a century as far as beat responsibility, reporting responsibility, source relations. I just wanted the ability to break information as fast as possible. And so we assembled basically a team of people that could cover any story on any given day and break information. And then from there, it kind of expanded. And so when you look at kind of what my role at the news has been and what it will continue to be, it's kind of the same. I've kind of been the chief disruptor in the newsroom when it comes to pressing people to rethink about what we do and how we do it, and can we do it better or do it differently next time. And so that's kind of the role I've had here, which I think has led me to this position now, is that I've kind of broken down a lot of our culture here that I thought was holding us back as far as I wanted the newsroom to be more accessible. I wanted the newsroom to be more accountable. I wanted the newsroom to be more transparent. And I wanted people to get information in a way that was faster but more accurate than our competitors. And that's kind of been our goals, and we've kind of seen those through. And that will continue under my tenure in this position, which is not really that different from what I had been previously doing as local editor, which was just basically focusing on the news component, but now my attention kind of spreads beyond into other departments. And the one thing that has kind of benefited me in my career is that I've had roles in almost every department in a newsroom. And so at least among staff, I have instant credibility, I think, with my colleagues because I've done their jobs, I've served in their situations, and I know what they're going through, and I can kind of lead them through that. And so I don't think what you'll see from me is dramatic change, only because the changes you've been seeing over the years here have kind of been the byproduct of my work.
Yeah, understood. Certainly sounds like what was considered the B team in 2006 is probably the A team now.
Absolutely.
What were some, maybe what has surprised you along the way in terms of you obviously had some early premonitions about what was happening from a news perspective and the shift to digital. What of those premonitions maybe have come true, or what has been surprising that maybe hasn't come to fruition in that process?
So a couple things. One thing I would say is the reader's understanding of what we do and how it's changed here. And I think these are good conversations so you guys are aware of kind of how news gathering has changed over the years. For instance, I was heavily involved in coverage of, a lot of props here from newspapers, coverage of our former mayor, Kwame Kilpatrick. And on the day that he was found guilty on numerous charges, we were updating the coverage consistently throughout the day. And I don't think the readers have a true understanding of how often stories are updated. That story in particular of his verdict that day updated more than 300 times. So chances are anytime you loaded that story that day, you got a new version of that story. There's times in which we're so aggressive in reporting, it's almost like you're reading news in real time. For instance, there's occasions where I send reporters out to barricaded gunman situations, and there was an instance where we were reporting on the scene of a barricaded gunman. The police had deployed a robot to go into the house, and we were reporting this in real time. And I remember getting a comment from a reader, "Well, what happened next?" And I said, "It hasn't happened yet. That's how quickly you've consumed this." So there's times now where you're getting information within seconds of it actually happening in real life. And so I think when you talk about the speed increases, they're tremendous. When I first started out at a newspaper in Michigan, you were just kind of focused on the next day's news. And you were reading the wires throughout the day, so you were getting news in real time, but your readers weren't. And now readers are getting that same experience that I had before cell phones took over the news, where you guys are following along the news throughout the day and getting it as fast as we are.
Well, I think that's a great segue to kind of the current environment. I'm sure there's been no greater example of having to report on changing stories and things changing in real time than COVID-19. So, can you just give us a glimpse inside of what it's like to be running a paper right now, a large regional and statewide paper in the COVID-19 era, and just what it looks like in your newsroom, and kind of what the reality of is what you're dealing with day to day right now?
So I would say that I have almost an unlimited amount of energy when it comes to covering the news, but I would say that even COVID is testing that. When we were first starting to get reports of possible positive COVID cases in Michigan, this is well before the first ones were confirmed. We were kind of already prepared to break this story, and the test results would come back negative, but there were people that had been traveling overseas that were coming back to Michigan that had symptoms. And so we kind of had all these false alarms that you guys didn't hear about or know about. And so we had all these moments where we thought we were about ready to let Michigan know that we had COVID present in the state. And I don't think, as mentally prepared as we were, because we had those false starts, I don't think we really understood how much it was going to change our newsroom as quickly as it did. The first COVID positive case happened on election day during our primary. So it's already a day where I have expanded hours for news coverage. I have all staff activated. And so we're already tired going into covering, a fairly significant moment in Michigan's political history, and deciding at that point it was a showdown between Biden and Sanders. So, and Michigan was very much in play nationally. So with that respect, we were already tired when we started getting early indication from our sources that we potentially had our first COVID cases. From that moment, which I believe the governor held a press conference at 10:45 that night, so right before the 11 o'clock news. And as we're starting to wind down our political reporting, because at that point, most of the precincts had reported and we had already called the race in Michigan. We were basically re-energized, and we're starting a marathon that really didn't end in any meaningful way for more than a month. I think I worked probably 90 to 100-hour weeks for 4 weeks straight. I took no days off. We kind of joked that it was like covering a fire hose that just wouldn't turn off. And we really feel that fire hose has continued, not so much as it was the first couple days or weeks, but it has continued to be the largest news story I've ever covered in my career. And I was a reporter during 9/11, and I never thought anything would ever top that at the time. And I think you have the initial wave of, okay, it's here. What does that mean? What's closing, to, okay, what should reopen, to now we're starting to cover what is reopening. Last night we broke that the Archdiocese in Detroit had announced that Mass would pick up next week. And so now here's the next wave of how the economy reopens in Michigan that we're covering. And there's still obviously a lot of contention. So I would say that component, and then one other minor component, but has been probably even more important to us internally, is I now have to cover this, in which I put people, we're considered essential workers. I'm putting people in danger. It's something that I'm used to in my career. I've sent people into active shooting situations. I've sent people into riots. That is, as an editor, the most difficult decisions I have to make as far as putting people in harm's way. And I have to do that now daily, where before it was not, something that was always something I was dealing with. But now I'm putting reporters in the middle of protests in Lansing, with people that aren't wearing masks that potentially could be spreading the virus. And I have to make news judgments based on whether or not my people are going to be safe, and to be able to cover the news in the way that we need to cover it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point in that how is that influencing, news decisions at large, and how do you, obviously, COVID is going to continue to be a story for the foreseeable future. What do you see as kind of the next wave, and or how do you reconcile covering non-COVID news, or is there ever an environment in the not too distant future that we return to non-COVID news coverage? Can you just give kind of your insight on what the future potentially holds from that perspective?
So I love hard news, and I love like investigative watchdog in your face reporting. But I have to admit, this has been one of the few times in my own career where I realized that um, I have to back off the gas pedal a little bit, because if I provide nothing but that hard news, it is overwhelming for our readership. And so I have gone out of my way to look for good news stories. That is the number one thing I get from readers, is we want more good news. However, I see all the analytics, and I know you don't want more good news. You want to know the truth and the hard news. But we have gone out of our way to kind of give the bright moments that have existed during the pandemic, to kind of balance everything out. Because if we tell everyone nothing more than the death count every day, it's difficult. But I'll say this. One of the surprises out of our coverage is we do something every week that it did well traffic wise for us, and it was kind of harmless. So I never had any disinterest in eliminating it from our coverage, but it has grown into be a very interesting traffic leader for us, which is we like to do a feature every week on a real estate property for sale. Usually it's something extravagant. I think everyone has been bottled up so much in their homes that they want to look at walk-in closets, and they want to see, swimming pools and, 5-car garages. And so that coverage has absolutely got everyone's attention. When we post that story on Saturdays, and people just spend their weekends reading about whatever real estate property we focused on. So I think that's been kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But there's that challenge of covering non-COVID news, and we've tried to do that. We had stories already done and ready to go when COVID broke that we've had to spike because they would seem inappropriate. The photos show people not observing social distancing. These are things that probably won't resume the way they were captured when we covered them. So we've had to pivot when it comes to how we cover the news in light of this, as well as giving you a balance of more than just the doom and gloom of COVID.
For many of our members who, maybe have established relationships with some of your reporters, obviously we know the economic and business side of this situation has been difficult for many, and we know that the news has had to look at furloughs and layoffs, even prior to and throughout the COVID situation. So can you just kind of share in terms of how that impacts the kind of news reporting and the environment, and just kind of what it's looked like in terms of returning staff, and what the dynamics are from a workforce perspective?
So one of my roles has been over the years is looking at the data. I've been a huge data guy as far as looking at our analytics and looking at our production. And so I can see anytime there's a drop off, both in readership as well as content. And what's been interesting is I think journalists, like many other professions right now that are deemed essential, feel a sense of obligation and duty in their day. And so despite the fact that we have shrunk our staff to kind of weather this economic storm with furloughs, and despite the fact that you would think working in this environment would be more challenging and dangerous, that it would discourage people from being able to do kind of the work they would normally do. We have not seen any drop off in the number of stories that we're reporting. Everyone is basically working as hard as they can for that greater sense of that this is our contribution to the world right now in a very difficult time. And we feel like the best thing we can do as journalists is making sure that we provide those who read us the best possible information that we can give you guys. And so even though it's been challenging from a coordination standpoint, because we have fewer people to assign news to, we've been doing it in a way that I don't think we've really missed anything that we would have not normally covered. It's just, and I credit our staff for that. They are really dedicated to what we do here. And I can't tell you the number of times where I've asked a staff member after 11 hours of work to do more. And it's a hard ask, but you know, I've never once been told no, because they know it's an important request.
Yeah, certainly. And I think we've all seen that, you know, articulated through, you know, through the great reporting we've seen during this time. You know, you mentioned metrics, and we all know on the PR side just how critically newsrooms are looking at metrics and how that influences news coverage at large. You know, I know Gary Miles had shared a couple weeks ago on Twitter, like a snapshot of the Detroit news metrics,
Yep.
just, you know, the sort of level of interaction and engagement. And I know when you and I talked prior to this, you sort of said from a metrics perspective, you come in and every day is your best day.
Yeah.
So can you talk about just the role that metrics play in the newsroom at large, you know, independent of the COVID situation, and also kind of during COVID, those kind of two sides of the equation?
Yeah, so I'm really loud on this in the newsroom because it's very important to understand what metrics are and what they are not. What they are is a guide. They're not a rule book, and they can. There's times where the numbers can lie to you, and I like 9/11 as an example of this. Like, if we don't put a 9/11 story up, even though at this point we're so many years past now, like, you know, nearly 19 years past, people will notice. But I know nobody will read that story. As sad as that is, most people have moved on from 9/11 coverage, and the numbers are always very low. And you know, I'll say to the staff, like, we need to give people news broccoli at times, because it's important that they know this is the complete picture of what the news is today, even though, you know, it's not something that they're going to click. And if you just focus on clickbait, you might get, you know, immediate gratification, but you lose your long-term core loyal audience, because they expect your best, and your best is not often clickbait. And so that's kind of where I use analytics, is making sure that we're being smart with our best content, and we're publishing at times where we know we have our largest audience available to see it, and that we're putting it on social at a time where it will be shared. But we're not just responding to, hey, people like stories about Britney Spears, so now we're just going to cover Britney Spears.
Yeah, I think, you know, what has surprised you from a metrics perspective, you obviously touched on kind of the real estate piece of showcasing opulent homes and how that's maybe been an escape for some people. What has maybe pleasantly or unpleasantly surprised you in terms of what has really shown traction from a metrics perspective?
So this is going to sound arrogant, but it's not, and it's very important. Very little surprises me, because it's my job not to be surprised. I should understand the numbers enough to be able to project how a story should do before we even publish. And if I can't, then I'm not doing my job. But what I can say is there's times where there's a story that I know is strong that's underperforming, and so we reevaluate really quickly. Why is this story not performing to our expectation, and what do we need to change? Is it not communicated in the headline? Are we not appealing to our social audience in a way? Like, yesterday is a good example. This is a very easy story for us to do well, almost no thought. The Blue Angels are in town. I know people are going to want to see pictures. If you went to see the Blue Angels yourself, you probably noticed that you could barely see them. They were low. They were only above your head for maybe 2 or 3 seconds. Well, I had a dozen people around the city taking pictures with, you know, long lenses, and the ability to capture them in a way that 99% of our audience couldn't. So the very first social post we put up did poorly. And so immediately I challenged our web desk, and I said, okay, this audience did not match what it should be. Please repost this story with just photos teasing back to the original story. Let's give people more pictures and more experience on social before they click in. And that took off like wildfire. And that was like just 30 minutes after we posted the original post. So those are the things that I have to kind of look out for. Very little surprises me. I will say that COVID has rechanged the landscape. So this is something that maybe this audience would find most important, and maybe a free tip from me to you. So in the news business, we know our readers very well. Other than your name, I know how long you read a story. I know where you drop off in the story. I know where you're coming from. Like, I know so much about you other than who you actually are, that I know what stories will do well, let's say in the suburbs versus Detroit versus Canada. I know stories that will post on certain topics out of the auto industry will have interest in India and China. So the one thing I would pass along here is, a lot of times we get embargoes from companies saying, okay, we'll give you this information if you embargo it for a certain time. And I'll look at the time and I'll say, I've got no audience at this point. This won't be actually something that will be seen until probably 6 hours later. Like, you're going to miss our print edition, so it's going to be a whole extra day with this. So the one thing I would say is, because we know our audience so well, is when you have information that you're trying to get out in a meaningful way, I would listen to the publication, because they should know where they can get maximum, I'd say, bang for your buck.
Do you have any, to that point, like any tactical considerations just for the benefit of our audience around embargoes? Like, do you want to share, okay, this is our cutoff time for print or the like, just for this audience?
Yeah, so this is probably something that is less known. Like, we know where our biggest numbers are, both web and print. And so as we develop stories throughout, not really even the week, the month, we're targeting certain stories for certain days at certain hours, because we know that this is our best work and that we want the largest audience to see it. Anytime we have a story that we know, other than a breaking competitive story, but with something that's exclusive to us, we put a lot of thought into when to share that information. And it's never just, it's done, let's just throw it up and see if there's an audience for it. Those days ended a decade ago. Everything is very calculated on our end as far as when we distribute exclusive news. Now, breaking news, it's, as soon as we have it reported, it's verified and it's ready to go. But when it comes to embargoed or exclusive content, like, there needs to be consideration. Like, our trucks are out at 5 a.m., so it's out on the street early morning. We've got, a print deadline. We're still one of the last papers that prints pretty late in comparison to others around the country. So that affords us to get late news into the next day's paper. And so there's times where we're still, in the 10 o'clock hour, still making changes to the print edition. We know what days are our best traffic days digitally, although COVID has really changed that. So when you have good news that you really want to break with a publication, I would just say, talk to them about, what is the most meaningful way to do that. COVID is, everybody's home, everybody's ready to consume news whenever we post it. We've posted stories at 10 o'clock on a Friday night, which is normally a fairly dead time for us, that have gone viral and have had our largest single greatest day was a Saturday during COVID, which would not normally be one of our high readership days.
Sure. Obviously, again, I feel like everything in this environment is asterisk with sort of the COVID consideration, but can you share with the fellow PR pros on the call about this news consumption trends in general that might be relevant for our audience as we're looking to obviously pitch stories or reach out to you with potential stories? Are there particular areas that you are looking to bolster your coverage and or potential areas that folks that have sources could help with? Is there just some news consumption trends we should be paying attention to as we look to create news with you?
So I can speak specifically to the Detroit News viewpoint here. Like I said, when I was on that task force and we were developing kind of the re-envision of what news was going to be for us, it was very difficult to get my bosses at the time to buy into this, but to their credit, they did. Was that I wanted us to be committed to covering local news and covering the issues that we're well known for. And I was trying to get us away from just being another website that was chasing clickbait like a lot of others at the time, because that's where your page views were. If you chased viral national clickbait news, you did very well. And it was very hard to convince people at the time to not go that route. And I like to use one news story in particular as kind of a defining moment for us. I think a lot of you may recall this. Do you remember that story about what color the dress was?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that did well for everybody but us. Like, that was not something that you would expect the Detroit News would have something unique to say on, right? You could get that anywhere, and you did. It was everywhere. At one point, we did post a wire version of that story, and I was like, we're really late on this. Now it looks like it took us forever to realize this was news. Two, our readers are mocking us because they expect better from us. Like, this is not who we are as a news organization. And so because of that understanding of what do we want to be as a newspaper, well, we want investigative, hard news. We cover the auto industry, we cover sports. We still have a film critic, which is a luxury that most newspapers don't have. We have something to say in that space that very few do. And certainly we cover Detroit. That's been a primary focus of mine through my career here, is making sure that we cover the city as hard as we covered the suburbs when I started, which has been kind of a role reversal. When you think of the Detroit News, 15 years ago, it was really the suburban Detroit News. We had many bureaus in place. We had a greater emphasis on suburbs, and we weren't covering the city as much. I was actually challenged early on when I was on the breaking news desk of I was covering a lot of stories out of Detroit, and the managing editor at the time asked me, why did I cover, the same issue in Detroit 2 days in a row? And I was like, well, it's a different story today. But he's like, well, you need to focus beyond Detroit. And I'm like, there's so much news here. How do you not tell this? I mean, what's happened in Detroit in the last 15 years has been more change than I would have expected in a lifetime, let alone, a decade plus. And so it's been an incredible story to cover. So when you think about those kinds of issues of kind of like who we are and what we need to focus on, we're trying to stay loyal to our readership. Our analytics show over time that, like, kind of draw in the air here, a lot of newspapers look like this, okay, traffic wise. It's because they have hot stories and then there's no news, hot stories and there's no news. Our analytics look like this. And what that tells you is people are coming to us regardless if there's news. We're a part of their day. Like, they want to check in with us and see what's going on, because they know that we're going to give them a complete picture of what's going on in Southeast Michigan and Metro Detroit. And we're limited, but we really do try to cover the entire state of Michigan, all the way up to sending people into the UP. And then we have a bureau in Washington, D.C. that's focusing on congressional behavior and how that impacts our state. So when you look at what we want pitched to us, it's with that group in mind, our core loyal audience that has been with us, that we've worked so hard to maintain and grow, that rely on us for information. So we really are dedicated to breaking information and reporting information that both impacts people in Metro Detroit and Michigan, and has, a Michigan flavor to it.
So we've got a lot of questions coming in, and so we'll start to get to those. I have one. I would be remiss if I didn't ask what is, I think, every journalist's favorite question when they're talking to a group of PR people. Maybe, how can PR people be better in terms of, what are maybe some of your pet peeves or issues that you see, coming from PR folks, that this is your opportunity as a journalist to air your grievances with the PR community. Can you give us some recommendations on, in all seriousness, maybe missteps or way to be more effective, kind of building on your last question, which I think gave some, or your last answer, which gave some great recommendations, but always like to ask that to journalists.
Yeah, so I probably get anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 emails a week. And that might actually be a low number. And a lot of that is PR companies from outside of Michigan who have gotten a hold of my email and just flood my inbox with irrelevant press releases. And I can't keep up with it. The most successful people that I work with in your industry are people that have formed a relationship with us over time, for both in the way they approach us, which is a conversation, not just here's information. Did you get it? Did you get it? Did you get it? Did you get it? Which I get like 900 emails about. Did you get this email? Did you get this email? When I see those emails come in from people that I've had conversations with that have given me stories before that I think have had tremendous impact and value, they immediately get my attention. The number one thing you can do that will get me angry, though, I can tell you, is set an embargo without even having a conversation with me and say, here's something, it's embargoed until 11 o'clock tomorrow. One, I haven't agreed to your embargo. Two, I might be chasing this already, and I might have reporters already working on this. And so we might report this outside of your embargo with no help from your release. So it's a conversation that needs to take place, not just an assumption that as soon as you send me a press release with an embargo, that is our agreement, because we haven't even talked yet. So that's important. And, you know, when we did have this conversation earlier, I brought up one company that always makes me laugh. It's Tim Hortons. They're always sending me emails that have embargoed requirements, and there's about some new donut. And it's like, at what point in the world do we need to be embargoing donut releases? But I guess we do.
No, great feedback. Thanks, Kevin. So with that, Jamie, I know you've been monitoring some of the questions coming in. Do you have some that you'd like to share with Kevin now?
I sure do. So we had a lot of great questions coming in. The first question we had come in is from Jordan. It says, how has speed increase impacted the process of ensuring news is fair, balanced, and representative, as you describe in the mission for the news? How can we as PR people help in that process?
Okay, those are great questions, because speed has obviously become a game changer, because we're not waiting for a daily print edition, right? And like I said earlier, it's almost in real time at times. I would say this. There was a huge surge, I would say, between 2012 and 2014 to just be first. Everybody wanted to be first on everything all the time. It was like the teamification of news. And what we saw out of that was reckless reporting. And there's a saying that I hear often in our industry is that, you know, bad information can get halfway around the world before the truth can get its pants on. And so anytime you get up something really fast and it's wrong, by the time you've corrected it, you've never had the same reach. So most people who saw your first report will not see your second. And the damage is tremendous on your brand. And I'm very proud at how few mistakes we make, because we hold our reporters and folks in the field to ridiculously high standards at times. There's times where I can guarantee you they want to throw shoes or whatever they have accessible to them at me, because we ask them for one more verification or for another source, or how does this source know this? And we really challenge them in an environment that is super competitive, because everybody has the ability to report anything at any time. And so there has been, I think, a pullback from us and others, to their credit as well, to slow down slightly, to really be sure that your information is perfect before you publish. And do we get everything right every time? No. But can I tell you that I have never seen us publish something reckless? Yes. All of our mistakes have been made with the best intentions and the most verification that we've had at the time. And I can't recall an instance where, when a mistake is made and I'm demanding an explanation as how the mistake was made, where I didn't understand at least how the mistake happened. Like, it seemed reasonable. We learned from it. And some of the mistakes that have occurred are so difficult at times, you would never imagine that, you know, you would make that mistake. Like, we had an instance, I want to say 10 years ago, where there was 2 kids in a house. One was dead, one was alive. We didn't know they were twins, and they had almost the same name, and their grandmother misidentified the dead twin. And we reported the wrong name as the twin who had died. And you never want to kill somebody more than once in the newspaper. And so that was a real learning lesson as far as extra verification. Even if a family member couldn't identify the deceased, like how are we comfortable reporting the way we did? So there's times where we do a lot of internal reflection on making sure that we don't make the same mistake twice, and make very few mistakes. It's kind of hell when you make a mistake. Like, we ask people to explain the full process of how it occurred and how it won't happen again. So there's that verification that is in place to guarantee that when we present information to you, that it is as accurate as we can get. Like I said earlier, the most attainable version of the truth.
Well, and just to piggyback on that, we have another question from Jason. Speaking of mistakes, he says he knows sometimes PR people make mistakes, but then they hear feedback about it from reporters when they do. How do you feel about PR people providing feedback to reporters or the newspaper when they might make a mistake? And if your reporters don't want to help, do you feel we should bring it to your attention?
So my boss would probably not like to hear this, but I know he's heard it before, so it probably won't hurt his feelings too much. He's my boss on paper, but my boss has always been our readers, which includes you guys. I take phone calls every day from people that demand better from us, and those are the people that I work for. And so I absolutely want to hear when we've missed the mark, because, like I said, I work for you. The purpose of the press is to inform and enlighten and to liberate people. That was its original intentions, and we've never strayed from that. At least I have never strayed from that. And I don't worry about our advertisers' reactions to our news coverage. I don't worry about our hedge fund that owns us as far as our coverage. Like, I cover the news. That's what I'm paid to do, and I do it in a way that I sleep at night. So if we're not doing it in a way that you feel is correct, I want to hear from you. And a reporter needs to be able to be held accountable, just like our reporters hold everybody else accountable.
Great, thank you. And so aside from embargoing donuts, what's one thing a PR person can do to ensure that they don't get put in your junk mail folder forever?
So there's actually some bad behavior that I appreciate. I do, as we've shrunk, like, I do need more than one email at times. I don't respond to all emails. That would be my full-time job if I did that. But I do pay attention to the emails coming in. And sometimes I get releases too far out. Like, as much as I'd love to plan for like an event on June 3rd, there's no way I'm doing that right now during COVID. But if you want to send me that release now, because that's when you've got it done and you want to put it on my radar, go ahead. But I would need a follow-up release, ahead of it. And even if I'm not responding, I'm seeing it, and that's how you get on my radar. I also appreciate very basic things like name, phone number, date, like really high in the release. Like, I don't want to fish for that information. So as much as you might want to like begin your pitch immediately in the release, like, the very first things I'm looking for at the release is who's sending this to me, how are they reachable, what is the name of the thing that you want me to cover, and when is it? Like, those basic questions, just get those out of the way first, so I now have an understanding of what I'm looking at before I start hearing the context of it.
Thanks, those are great tips. Randy would like to know, do you miss the camaraderie and idea sharing in the newsroom? How are you recreating that newsroom buzz remotely?
Yeah, so I'm in the newsroom now, and this is the second time I've been in the newsroom since we scattered at the end of March. And I miss it dearly, but I also recognize that we're built for this. Like, our reporters are constantly working remotely even before COVID. So this was not difficult for us to do, but what is difficult for us to do is the long-term strategy, the brainstorming sessions that we would normally have, that camaraderie that you can't really capture, in this environment. As much as I'd love to see all of you, like, most of you are just names on the screen, and it's not quite the same. And so there are times where I'm doing large group chats like this with staff, although we find eventually it gets too unwieldy and not everybody has the same internet speed. I know who's got good internet and bad internet at home now. And so that can almost be disruptive at times. People are like several seconds behind in questions and interrupting each other. So I'm sure these are all issues that you guys are probably dealing with as well. We're dealing with it. But I try to have as many face chats as I can with people. At first, I think it was a little bit surprising for them. Like I saw a lot of kitchen ceilings because nobody was ready to see me in person that day. Hair wasn't done, makeup apparently is an issue for some people. But as we've evolved, I've been told by many people that they appreciate that in-person interaction, that, you know, obviously not as good as face-to-face in real life, but it's as close as we can get.
So we have a question from Michelle about just kind of process. So for non-breaking news stories that don't necessarily fit within a beat for a specific beat reporter, can you walk us through the process that a reporter goes through to get permission to write a story, and how does that get approved if it falls outside of a specific beat?
Yeah. So two ways. One, it comes through a reporter, or two, it gets pitched to an editor and then it gets assigned that way. A couple things to keep in mind. One has been the great shift to digital, right? So before, when you had a print edition, you had, you know, a certain amount of inches on each page. Not every story could have a photo because of room. Well, the internet being what it is, like our visual needs have increased tremendously. So when you're starting to pitch stories, start already thinking ahead of us about what would visually represent this. Because if you're telling me you've got a pitch and it has a logical like piece of art that would work with it, like we could shoot you know, either something in person, or you have handout available art, that makes life a lot easier for us. Because if you look at our website, almost every story has a visual presence, and so crafting that into your own release is super important. As far as the pitch, so most reporters, well, not even most, all reporters really kind of need the blessing from an editor to work on something outside of their beats, or even sometimes on their beats. And so if you have a good story, I would recommend you pitch it to the reporter and their editor together. So this way there's a conversation that occurs. And maybe there's times where reporters are overworked and they don't want a pitch at that time because they know they can't handle anything, and so they'll ignore it even though it's a decent story. The editor will say, that's a decent story, but I know my reporter's booked. I'll look to a different reporter to cover this. I mean, most of my morning right now is just putting people in position to cover the news. Like I have a reporter in Washington right now in 40 minutes covering Mike Duggan's press conference because my Detroit reporter needs to be elsewhere in the city today. So it's kind of juggling that, you know, news requirement. So pitch it to more than one person, because this way that opens a dialogue. And one of the things I've tried to encourage reporters is to pitch ideas. Even if you're busy, you won't get self-assigned. Like I will assign this to other people if it comes through you.
Yeah, great feedback. Thank you. Question on how are you integrating with the Free Press? If you want to expand a little bit just on your relationship with the Free Press in general.
So the Free Press is below me, and that's our relationship. We are as separate as we can possibly be from news gathering standpoint. They are a direct competitor. My goal is to beat them on every story that we can beat them on, and if they beat us, I try to come back with a stronger story. There's no real true overlap other than I hope I get their best every day because it makes me better. And I respect a lot of their journalists. I think they cover the news differently than us, which I think is a blessing. They've taken a different approach to coverage, and that has given us an opportunity to cover the news differently. Like their audience is a little bit more national than ours, and we get to see some of their analytics, and I get to see some of our, you know, TV competitor analytics, and so I can kind of see that, you know, our route has been good for us. We've paid more attention to Metro Detroit, Michigan. That's where our audience is. If you're looking for news to really resonate locally, I would argue that we're the better option between the two papers. I think they have a larger megaphone when they've got a national story. Like, for instance, when Aretha Franklin died, that was a difficult story to compete because they had instant audience from a national spotlight perspective. So that's kind of our overlap with the Free Press. We share on Sunday an editorial page with them. They publish our home style section, but outside of that, it's North Korea, South Korea.
That's a candid answer. Appreciate that. Janie, next question. I mean, I think that'll probably be our last if we want to wrap with one more question.
Sure. So I have a question from Jennifer. She's asking if you're seeking positive stories of businesses or industries that are pivoting their services during COVID. Are there any specific angles to these type of stories that are of particular interest to the news?
Yeah, so this is difficult because so many businesses kind of did the same thing at the same time. Like, everybody was trying to build PPE. There was so much hand sanitizer flowing in Metro Detroit, weeks after COVID became an issue. So when you look at good news stories, or you're trying to highlight a positive thing about a business, really look to see what the coverage has been and see if this is something that hasn't been touched before, because I can only cover the same story so many times. And there's just not a lot of interest rereading. But also, what may have been not interesting 2 weeks ago may be re-energized by new needs that occur. The other thing I would say too is, even if it's something that you pitched early on and it wasn't covered, if you really think it's interesting, like, stay with it. Like, there was a pitch that we got looking at new technology that was being developed in Michigan through the assistance of Rick Snyder, where it's a ventilator that can support more than one person. And it had been pitched for us for a while. We just couldn't get to it, but it ended up being a really interesting story, and we still published it, even though it was a little bit dated from when the first pitch came in. There's times where we will circle back on a good story that we've not touched on. So don't give up. If you really believe you've got something that is worth sharing. There's just certain days where I have more stories than reporters.
What in general is your feeling, Kevin, about providing feedback? So when a PR professional comes back, if the answer is maybe no now, I think to your point of sticking with the story, are you annoyed when we come back and say, well, can you provide more information on why, or could this be a story for later on? What's your sort of feeling on that back and forth if the answer is no, continuing to pursue it?
Well, I would say this: like, the better you can create a relationship with reporters and editors, you'll have more feedback, because it can't always be transactional. Like, the day just doesn't allow it. And like, there are some people, and I saw some of the companies represented here, who some people on your staff have my cell phone number and text me at 11 o'clock at night story ideas, because we've built that relationship. They've have provided me really good information, and I know that when they have something to offer me, it's going to be something I will want to cover. To kind of cite a little bit to maybe a way that is effective to get news covered, a little bit different than your question. If you can provide us with some qualities that you're not giving others, like if you're saying, okay, this is exclusive to you, or because that matters. Like, it's not that you need to do that for every release. Like, I don't want exclusive donut news, like I said earlier, but if there's an important story that you think Michigan readers are going to want to read, with emphasis in Metro Detroit, and that's our bread and butter, that's our audience, like, and you want to offer us an exclusive story that makes sense timed wise for when we have traffic, like, you're going to have my attention. The other thing too is, when I mentioned how there's days where I have more stories than people, or if you send me a release at 10 o'clock on a Friday night when I don't have nearly the reporting staff that I would on, like, say, 11 o'clock on a Monday morning, like, those are all ways that impacted a news decision. So, like, affording me time and affording me exclusivity, and knowing that this is something that my readership would want to read, like, those are all things that over time, like, build a relationship that will get you to the front of the line.
All right. Well,
Oh, one other pet peeve real quick. There's a lot of times, this is like a new trend I've seen, and I don't think a lot of I looked at some of the companies that were participating, and there's no offenders on this list, but there's a lot of companies I've never heard from offering like research data, and that really concerns me, because like when you're pitching a story that's based on data, like, I really need to understand how you acquired this data, what the margin of error, how accurate it is. Like, for us to release that kind of information into the world, like, it really has to be vetted by us. So if the first time I'm hearing from your company is in a press release and you're providing me with data that I don't know how you got, like, there's so many red flags there. And I get a lot of those emails. It's like, Detroit ranks, this, in bed bugs, or Detroit is the sleepiest town in America. Like, those press releases always cause great concern. It's like, how do you prove this? How do you know this? Where did you get this information from? And then, I find out that this is, a release that is tied into a mattress company. So obviously, they want that known.
Yeah, well, I think that is a great point to end on. I want to thank you for your time. Really, really valuable information, and just appreciate you kind of sharing insight as to what your day-to-day life looks like right now, and how we can, potentially help better advance your mission in terms of doing a great job covering the news, in Detroit and in Michigan. So thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Did our best to get to most of the questions, but hopefully we can keep a dialogue going with Kevin and maybe follow up in the future. But thanks to everybody for joining, and have a great day.
I appreciate you guys having me, and a couple of you reached out before this, and I appreciate that. And like I said, have that relationship with your newsroom. And, I think that's the best way to kind of work through our needs and yours.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Great advice to keep in mind as we all try to navigate this new world. So thanks so much, Kevin. Thanks to all of our PRSA members who joined on. We will look for more information from PRSA Detroit on subsequent virtual programs. And thanks so much. Take care, everybody. Stay safe.
Thank you.